Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Team House. This is episode 138. I'm Jack Murphy here with David Park. We have Dee producing here behind the scenes. And our guest today is Zach Dorfman. He's a national security journalist, written for a number of different outlets. Writes for Yahoo News currently. Zach and I even collaborated in the past and wrote an article together about the Solemani Strike, which we'll get into later. He's also been writing a lot about the CIA. He writes a lot about the intelligence community in general, including some of the things going on in Ukraine at the moment. We'll get into that as well. But first off, Zach, thank you for joining us tonight on the show. We appreciate you spending your Friday evening with us.
No, it's great to be here, guys. I couldn't think of a better way to spend a Friday night.
That sounds like a lie, but we accept the compliment anyway.
It is a lie, but you know what? It's still early here on the West Coast, so I actually get to have a night after this.
So Zach, if you could start off telling us a little bit about yourself and what your upbringing was like and kind of what your path was into journalism.
Yeah, I never actually necessarily wanted to be a journalist, to be honest. I think I always really liked history. And so I always liked the idea that journalism was like the rough first draft of history. I grew up in Westchester County, New York, north of New York City in the 90s. I was like a skate rat, and I played in a bad jam band. We thought we were good, but we were bad. I never really, I liked English, I liked history. I was always really drawn to particularly U.S. history and the aspects of it that were not necessarily on the front pages or were only on the front pages because it was clear that people had done a lot of digging to get them out there. Mm-hmm. And so, again, I never wanted to be a journalist. I just didn't know. I was like a philosophy major in college, and 9/11 happened when I was a senior in high school, and I was in college for the Iraq War, and those were obviously for millennials. Those are all I'm just checking boxes as an elder millennial, basically, right?
Those are the things you and I are the same age and both Westchester County dirtbags from the same area. So it's funny. Yeah, I was a senior in high school too when 9/11 happened. So.
Yeah, I just remember, in hindsight, looking back on it now, now that I'm creeping toward 40, I feel very lucky that I had this period of my life before that. The whole 90s was pretty, I don't want to overstate it, right? There were wars, there was lots of bad things happening in the world, but it was pretty carefree, geopolitically, it didn't have this weight to it. And all that stuff happened when we were seniors, and it was terrifying, catastrophic. I'm sure you had the same thing. I'm sure that you, like me, knew people. Everybody was commuting into the city. Once parents lived in this, you know what I mean? It hit very, very close to home because it literally was close to home. Right. And so all of a sudden everything just went like that. Right. It was like that. And so then when the Bush administration started to pursue its policies in the war on terror, there was a wave of really extraordinary investigative journalism, right? That arose. And for me, as somebody in my 20s reading that kind of stuff, that was just this is the most amazing thing in the world that you could do, basically.
What was some of the stuff that sticks out in your mind that you were reading at that time?
The Cy Hirsch reporting of the period, the reporting on black sites that came about. Anything that had to do with the more unseemly aspects of the war on terror was impossible to turn away from. And the mainstream reporting on the I don't want to go down, this is an extremely, deep rabbit hole, but like anything that had to do with the Iraq war and the predication for the Iraq war was something that like I couldn't stop reading about, because it was clear at the time that there was something that was occurring, like American government, like the reality of American government was working in a different way than the way that I had been taught in civics class that American government was supposed to work, to put it lightly, right? And so investigative journalism always struck me as like to fill that gap, right? And I don't want to ennoble it too much because it's like a very imperfect profession, but like for me, that was always the kind of highest, the highest manifestation of it. But I wasn't working as a journalist then, right? I mean, I didn't start working as a journalist until, I worked in a think tank for years, and I was like in a much more kind of glacial and gentlemanly pace of things. But like, I always felt like I wanted to do something that was like more in the arena, and there was nothing more like immediate to me than the world of national security reporting. But it also seemed completely impenetrable too, right? Because it's not something that you just like, you don't go and get your like national security reporter stamp, and or your merit badge, and then you're doing it. So I started fairly late. I was already past 30 when I started doing that work. And I just started thinking about stuff that I thought was fascinating that people weren't reporting on, and finding those stories that are kind of hidden in plain sight was the thing that I realized that I could try to do with varying levels of success. And that's kind of how I've tried to approach reporting.
So what was kind of like your big break then, breaking into national security journalism? I mean, it's difficult. You're from your background, and now you're going to try to dig up the U.S. government's secrets. How did you even go about that? What was like the first piece that you got published?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is honestly just being like stupid and persistent, and lucky in a lot of ways. It's all those things. The first story that I remember thinking, okay, now I can actually get some movement, was a story I wrote for Foreign Policy magazine, which I have a really soft spot to this day for, because of an editor there. I had a real problem getting editors to return my emails, right? Like, it's not something like you're just like a guy, right? And you may have had a background in something journalism adjacent, but they're just like, okay, cool. You have no record. You're not, you don't have the right resume for it, right? You didn't already work. You're not freelancing after you already worked for a publication that everyone's like, oh, you worked on the New York Times. Okay, sure. Great. Whatever. So it took some trust, right? And I had been working on a story for months, in my spare time, that was about the closure of the consulate in San Francisco, the Russian consulate in San Francisco. The Trump administration closed the consulate there in 2017. And I don't know if you remember, but at the time, the consulate in San Francisco is a spectacular mansion set atop a hill in one of the most prestigious and expensive neighborhoods in San Francisco, and it has a direct line of sight out to the water, and it was a very, very important domestic facility for the Russians for many, many decades. And when they closed it, it was considered a big deal. And the Russians, all of a sudden, right after they closed it, the Russians started burning up documents. And so, imagine this rarefied environment, beautiful mansion, and on the top of a hill, and all of a sudden there's just smoke emanating from the top.
I remember that.
And it was like, well, okay, just because there's a station here, right? There's a residentura, and I just thought, okay, well, this is a story, right? Like, I'm out here. we know that there's espionage on the West Coast. We know that the Russians have had a presence here for decades. We know that other countries are also intensively interested in intelligence gathering in Silicon Valley and the West Coast more broadly. And it seems like people aren't really covering it because people are really focused on DC. I mean, reasonably, but it's bigger than DC. I mean, the counterintelligence story is much, much bigger. And so that I realized was maybe my way in. And then I just started reaching out to people. I started reaching out to people and reaching out to people and reaching out to people. And like my heart would beat, every time out of my chest, because I was just like some guy who was calling somebody who had worked in a position that was relevant to this, who, could have and sometimes did tell me to like politely fuck off, which was totally reasonable, but other people actually were like, no, this is an important story. And I'm glad you asked, and that just ended up being a story about the kind of stuff that counterintelligence folks believed that the Russians were doing in San Francisco, and some of the mysteries in terms of what they were doing and how they were trying to understand it. And since it had been shut down, and it's still shut down, it shut down in 2017, it is still shut down. Folks started talking to me about it. And I went to FP and I told them that I had been spending months and months and months trying to, get string on this story. And I had gotten enough for something that was, I thought, a really great spy story. And they agreed. And that was the first like investigative piece that I ever published. And it took a long time, and I couldn't believe it, right? It just was like, I couldn't believe that anyone actually talked to me. I couldn't believe that they published it. Like it was, I tried to like, you try to play it cool at the time. You're like, oh, I have this piece, but like I was thrilled, I was thrilled, and it taught me a lot. And things got a little easier every time I published something after that, so that was the first big story. And I haven't written about it as much lately, but like West Coast espionage stuff is like totally near and dear to my heart. And I will write about, I mean, if I could, and I hopefully one day I will write a book about like, Silicon Valley espionage.
Excuse me.
Because I think I don't know. I think it's, again, totally fascinating. It's gotten more attention in the last 3 or 4 years, but it's still totally underreported in my opinion.
So that was kind of your big break into national security journalism, and since then you've been writing for you're a Yahoo News staff writer, correct?
Yeah, I'm a I think national security correspondent, I think is the actual title at this point. I don't remember. Yeah.
Well, speaking as somebody who really does not understand like the business or the environment, the human environment of the field of journalism, you were actually somebody who helped me out a lot too. When I needed somebody to listen to me.
Yeah, thanks, man. Well, I mean, I think part of it is also just like, you got to find like a small group of people that understand what you do and like return your calls and emails. I mean, I remember like my wife told me once, like I had forgotten this, I think in like a moment of like despair when I was trying to start doing this, I think I just said to her, like, I just need like 3 editors who will return my emails, because it was just like sending shit into a black hole, right? You'd be like, I have this amazing pitch or I have this story, but I don't know how to frame it. Like, can we talk? Can somebody, from the organization who works on this talk to me about it? And it was just like, it was really, 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 really hard. And I think it's difficult if you're not a staff writer in these places and you haven't been through that system to get people to like, I don't know, to stop what they're doing and actually listen to somebody from the outside who's like, no, seriously, I have an amazing story, or like, I have the sources for this. And I actually think it's been really bad, not just because it affected me badly. I don't want to just say that because to personalize it, but I think it's been bad for national security journalism in general. Because I just think that like it's been narrowed down because you don't have, folks who are not staff writers like you, who obviously know a lot of people and get stories that other people don't get. Like editors should I don't know. It's been a pet peeve of mine for a while, and I don't know how to solve it, honestly, because you need, editors like Sharon Weinberger, who's now at the Wall Street Journal, who we've both worked with a lot, who, you text her and you're like, I have an amazing lead, like you want your editor to be more excited than you are, about this thing, right? And like to be able to talk it over with you. And I think it's hard. It's hard to find somebody like that.
Yeah, no, Sharon's awesome, and definitely improved the quality of my work. Like, I mean, and the story we did together too. I mean, compared to our thoughts can be really jumbled, and when you work on I think I told her this. Like when you work on a story for a long enough time, like your perspective gets kind of skewed because you're so hyper focused on this thing, and it's like I read the story for myself. And it's like, well, she can kind of like broaden the picture and explain to me like why this matters to the public at large and how to frame it. I think that was the term you used.
Yeah, I mean that you get extreme tunnel vision, and you actually stop at a certain point on investigative stories. And this happens to me every single time I do one. I lose the plot at some point. I'm like too close to it, and like a great editor helps you zoom in and out in ways when you're like, this is over-reported or under-reported, or there's too much detail, or there's like something that you think is so obvious, but like the average reader that hasn't been thinking about this one little thing for 8 months of their life doesn't understand, or like you need to front load. And I think a great editor in the national security world can do that. And I think it's also about the translation function, I mean, I think another thing that, I doubt Sharon is watching this, but, shout out to Sharon again, like one thing that she has said to me multiple times is, you're not writing for intelligence professionals.
Yeah, exactly.
like you have to write for people that care about this stuff, but didn't spend their professional lives thinking about this every day, because like, yeah, you want all these cool details and you want all this like technical language, but like it has to be something that like, a dentist on the Upper West Side like will read and understand and enjoy and maybe be troubled by, and like talk over dinner with his wife about. And I think that was really important too, because for me, I don't know, I think the way I approached it was way too much like the other way, and so that was also a learning curve.
We try to be cognizant of it even on this show, because like Dave and I have these people on, and we can have a total like insider baseball sort of conversation with some people that like it sounds like to everyone else like we're speaking an alien language. So we try to
sometimes to me, man, I don't know the special operations language as well as you guys do. And so somebody will be like, I was in a SOC and I was on JWIX, and I'm just like, what the fuck? I can't, like there's a certain...
I had a drink with a reporter friend the other day, and I was probably really annoying. I won't say his name here. He's actually a really good guy, but he was talking to another reporter, and he was like, okay, so all Navy SEALs are in JSOC. I'm like, okay, stop. I had to like make him stand down like 5 times. Like, no, that's not like... This is how the CIA sheep dips military. No, stop. That's not how that works. He's a good guy, really good guy, but yeah doesn't speak the language.
Yeah, it's confusing. And I think different reporters have different, I'm not like a Pentagon reporter, right? I've reported on military stuff, but I'm much more comfortable in I understand the institution of the CIA and the FBI and the NSA far, far better than I understand the Pentagon, which is like this massive unwieldy beast that like the acronyms like confuse and terrify me. And like, I just don't, I know that I don't know a lot about it, and I understand completely why people spend their entire career only focused on that building.
Zach, I mean, I was in the military, and I've now reported on the military for 10 years. And what keeps it interesting is that I learn new stuff all the time because, like you said, it's so huge. No, I mean, does anybody even really have a full picture of what the hell is going on in the Pentagon? I don't think so.
I mean, I see acronyms all the time that I have to look up, and I'm like,
Yeah, I mean, but there's always like some new subject that you can jump into, and it's like I knew nothing about this until now.
Yeah, between that and like, SAPs and the black budget, it's actually impossible to wrap your head around by, I would say, in effect, if not by design, and probably partially by design. Actually, definitely partially by design. Yeah, I mean, that's why that budget exists as the way it does. And so it is, and it's interesting too, because when you speak to folks in the intelligence world, there are folks who come from military intelligence background. I remember speaking to them and I would talk about CIA, and I had one guy once tell me he was like, "Stop talking to me about the CIA. They're tiny." He was like, "I don't care about the CIA." He was kind of like, "Do you have any idea how small their budget is compared to our budget? Like, don't like, you're making an error, a fallacy of making them 10 feet tall. Meanwhile, we're 100 feet tall."
Right.
So, I just realized like in a second I had to be like, okay, there's a lot of truth to what he's saying there. And you get very focused on the narrow lane that you report on, right? And so I thought that was an interesting, that definitely like shook me for a second,
Zach, I want to hit up some of your greatest hits here. And I was wondering if you could start off by telling us about Christine Fung. Who was she?
Sure. Yeah. That's a great West Coast story, actually. Christine Fung was, there's a story that a fantastic China reporter from Axios, Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, and I wrote about Christine Fung. Christine Fung was a suspected Chinese intelligence operative who lived in the Bay Area in the mid 2010s, and she early 2010s, mid 2010s, and she, FBI counterintelligence believed that she was trying to kind of infiltrate local politics in the Bay Area. And so she just was kind of like, she was one of those people who was everywhere, right? We kept hearing this over and over and over again from folks, civic-minded folks in local democratic politics in the Bay Area, which is, whether that's the only politics that matters here, right? There is no Republican politics to speak of in the Bay Area. So she tried to infiltrate local democratic politics, which are complicated and very, very competitive internally. But so she just started showing up at all of these events and trying to intern with different political candidates. And she was a student at a local college in the East Bay. She was a Chinese national, and she became associated with the campaign of a city councilman from an East Bay city at the time named Eric Swalwell, who later was elected to Congress and became a member of the House Intel Committee. And when he was running some of his earlier campaigns, she, according to sources we spoke to, bundled donations for his campaigns. So for I think at least one of his campaign cycles, and bundlers collect donations from other people. So they raise money from other people. It's like the person who throws a party and then gets the checks and then hands the check over to a campaign. Now, she herself could not donate to his campaign because she was a foreign national, and there was no evidence whatsoever that we found that she had done so, and that would have been I think an FEC violation. And I want to reiterate again, no evidence that was done. But she was bundling, according to folks that we spoke to. And she also helped place at least one intern in Swalwell's Washington, D.C. office. And additionally, we had learned that, according to some of the intelligence folks that we spoke with, that she became a subject of a intensive FBI investigation, intensive. And there was some bugging that occurred. And, there was at least one instance where she seemed to also be initiating sexual relationships with at least a few mayors. And there was one instance where she was caught in her car performing a sex act on somebody, and the FBI caught that on at least audio, if I recall correctly from the story. And so, it was kind of a tawdry case, right? Because you had somebody who was a suspected Chinese intelligence operative who was like getting into local politics and, potentially, having sexual relationships with some potential targets, and had actually gotten close to somebody who later on became, she was in the orbit of his campaign when he was a congressman, and then later on became the congressman at a very, very sensitive committee. So, according to our reporting, she, at some point the Bureau gave what is known as a defensive briefing to Congressman Swalwell's campaign and said, "You got a problem." Basically, like, you got to watch out for this person. This person is, should not be anywhere near the orbit of your offices or your campaigns. And again, according to our reporting, that was the first they had any understanding necessarily that she might be, bad news, and they immediately severed all potential connections. So he has not been accused of wrongdoing in the story, but it's the way that we told that story was specifically about influence and political influence, and the way that Chinese intelligence agencies, if the allegations are true and she is in fact an intelligence operative, the Chinese intelligence agencies have sought to work operatives into American politics. And most people think about this, it's like really sexy to think about it at the like national level, right? There's another story I reported on where there was another suspected intelligence operative in the Bay Area who worked on Dianne Feinstein's staff out here. I broke that story too. And so that's a little bit more like, Feinstein was already a senator, right? With a long history of being on Senate Intel too. So she was very, very prominent for a very long time by the time that happened. But most people don't think about the more like workaday aspects of it, which is that like it's a long game and you have operatives that are trying to understand the rising stars of today, because every 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 people that you seek connections with now, maybe in 10 or 15 years, one of those guys gets elected to Congress, and then maybe he becomes a HIPSI. He sits on HIPSI, right? Which is exactly what happened with Swalwell's case. And so it's about the modus operandi of the Chinese services. And I spoke to other counterintelligence officials who are like, this has been a problem going back to the 90s in the Bay Area. The Bay Area has always had, Chinese services have always focused on political influence in the Bay Area because they understand that it's important for Washington, it's important for California, and it's important for bilateral relations for China and the U.S. I mean, the Bay Area has an old and large and very settled and very prominent community of Chinese descent here. Folks who came way before the People's Republic even existed, and waves after that. And they have always also viewed it a little bit as a threat, because there's a memory that like exile communities can produce opposition movements to those in power in China. Mm-hmm. And so there's always been that aspect too, of a little bit of like concern about that those politics here can bounce back in ways that the Chinese Communist Party does not want to happen.
I don't know if you saw, Zach, but last week the Department of Justice unsealed indictments for 5 people. They were charged variously with stalking, harassing, and spying on U.S. residents on behalf of the Chinese secret police. So these are people who are suspected to work for MSS. And one of the people that they were stalking was a guy who was running for Congress here in Brooklyn. And apparently this dude was a Tiananmen Square survivor. immigrated to the United States, served in the U.S. Army, got out, was running for Congress, and one of the alleged MSS operatives hired a private investigator. And first, he was asking to find compromising material. If not, create compromising material. Failing that, actually discussed hurting or killing him, like running him down with a car.
I had heard a little bit about that story. I mean, it's shocking. It's one of those like shocking but not surprising stories where, I mean, one, other than San Francisco, New York is the other major center of where the Chinese are doing this. I mean, again, huge, prominent, longstanding Chinese and Chinese American communities. And there have been these stories over the years of, for instance, apparently, they used to have, I forget where this was reported, but, they had people who were operatives who were just spying on Falun Gong folks in New York. I mean, like they were very, very involved in that stuff. You've heard some stories of people being stalked or surveilled in Washington, D.C. There's a story I published for Foreign Policy, maybe 2018 or so, about the wave of like Chinese renditions or soft renditions all over the world. It depends on the definition, gets a little bit fuzzy, but there were cases that I was told about from U.S. counterintelligence officials where, it gets, again, it becomes a little semantic, like a semantic distinction where when you're talking about kidnapping, because like imagine somebody knocks on your door and they say, hello, you're going to come with me right now. I have 2 tickets to SFO on a flight directly to Beijing in 6 hours. And you say, no, hell no, I'm not going to do it. And they say, if you don't do that, then, your uncle or your parents or your sibling back on the mainland is going to be thrown in prison for the next like 30 years. And I promise you, it's not going to be pretty. And like, that's the kind of thing that was happening. Especially after Xi Jinping rose to power and they did the anti-corruption campaign. And so there's this kind of like long arm of the Chinese state that is very much like, it's a very real thing in the US, and particularly New York and San Francisco.
When I was at Columbia University, I kind of got exposed to a little bit of that and some interesting situations. And there's one time where I was in a group with 3 Chinese students, and we were having a little bit of a conversation back and forth. And I asked something that was very naive in retrospect, the way I did it. I asked what their thoughts were about Falun Gong. Like, for real, just tell me, what do you think? Do you think they're good? Do you think they're bad? And brother, you could have heard a pin drop in that room. You could hear the second hand on the clock ticking. Because they're all afraid that somebody's going to inform on them. Like there's 4 of us in the room. Which one is going to call back home and say, hey, this dude is, maybe a sympathizer.
I mean, that is a real thing. I think people, there's been a lot of nasty shit around this topic in the last 3 or 4 years. And a lot of stuff has strayed just into like straight racism and xenophobia. And it's really unfortunate because it's so important to underline that the number one victims of this stuff are like mostly Chinese students in the US, and like they're the ones who are living in fear of being ratted out, right? I mean, I was told, I have to go back to the but like some Chinese students associations, they like, you can't speak freely because there's this sense that at least one person who is attached to it has a relationship with an MSS officer, stationed at a nearby diplomatic facility. Like I know that was the case in San Francisco. I know that there was, they specifically put an MSS officer in the position in the consulate here. At least this was the suspicion of FBI counterintelligence, was that the guy whose job was outreach to the local community and particularly students was an MSS officer. I mean, that tells you something about the priorities of that country, right? Like your intelligence service is like, we only have X number of slots, right, in every diplomatic facility. Like, what do we care about? right? And they'd be like, to give up a slot because you want to make sure you keep an eye on students and on the diaspora tells you a lot about them.
Right. Wait, Zach, what publication did you publish both, the articles on Swalwell and Feinstein's on those two people on?
So the Swalwell article was in Axios,
Okay,
and the Feinstein story was actually part of just a big story that I did on spying in the Bay Area, and so it was about Chinese and Russian, mostly Chinese and Russian, the history of Chinese and Russian espionage in the Bay Area, and so they were kind of different publications. So I don't think people kind of piece them together because they were. But they're really kind of a series. Honestly, there's kind of like a quasi-series of kind of spying in the Bay Area.
Did you have a hard time finding publishers for those?
I think after the original FP story on the Russian consulate here, which did really well for FP, got a lot of eyeballs, I think there was this understanding that this is a topic people care about. People want to read about this, and so Politico was actually pretty enthusiastic about that story. In hindsight, maybe the Feinstein stuff shouldn't have been in paragraph 8 or 9 or 10, because it was actually in hindsight it was like it's a very serious thing to have happen.
Right.
The Axios story, the Axios was very, very supportive of it. And it was an intensive process because it was such a sensitive story.
Sure.
I mean, a young Chinese woman alleged by U.S. officials to be working as an MSS operative who gets close to a sitting U.S. congressman and his campaign, and it was one of those things that we were kind of like dancing through the raindrops on it, and we tried to do it in as non-sensationalistic way as possible, but it took on a velocity of its own.
Well, I'm curious, and I don't want to throw shade here, so I'm going to ask you sort of, why do you think that like a major publication like the New York Times would never cover either of those stories? Do you think that they didn't think they were sourced well enough? Do you think that it was because they wanted to fly top cover, or do you think it was for some Chinese, like the whole Mao, he was a great revolutionary type thing? Or do you think they just didn't think it was newsworthy?
I don't think it was the last. I don't think it was I don't think it was because of any ideological fellow traveling at all. You'd have to ask the New York Times. I've asked myself this question a lot after the Christine Fung story, which was like why there wasn't follow-up from other major outlets, because it was 100% true. Right. Not only was it 100% true, we actually got I believe if you go back, Ratcliffe, when he was acting DNI, gave a briefing about the case to Kevin McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi. That was public. It actually they acknowledged that the story was true. Nobody denied any of it. The sourcing was impeccable. And I was a little confused about the lack of follow-up from some of the major papers. I think there's a couple of reasons for it. One is I think the major papers, they match each other and they don't really view anything that's not in the other one to be worthy of their time to an extent. So the Times will publish a really, really excellent explosive story, and then the Post will have to match it. But if it appears in a publication that's not as prominent, sometimes they don't do it. That's just built into the media ecosystem, for better and for worse. People have only so many hours in a day. There are great journalists in these publications that are chasing their own stories. I don't want to throw too much shade on it, but I was when I publish these stories a lot, the Fung story is a really good example. I want other journalists to keep the story alive. Every journalist wants other journalists to operate in a pack, which is kind of like how, Watergate occurred. I mean, people always associate Woodward and Bernstein, but like there were many other good journalists, great journalists that were, engaged in Watergate scoops. And so you want other journalists with other sourcing networks to keep the story going. And there was more to that story, to that Christine Fung story. There was absolutely more to that story than we published. And I was really hoping that other folks would pick it up, and they didn't. The other explanation is that, and this is true sometimes, and I don't think it would have been true in the Christine Fung case, but it is true. Sometimes you do like a 6-month investigation and you just grind a story to its absolute bones, and nobody can really match you. Nobody can really do what you've already done. And so there are internal discussions when outlets are just like, should we invest the time and resources into it? And then they're just like, no, it's not worth it. We can't, it would take too much. But yeah, I mean, the Post, I think, covered the story in terms of the fallout a little bit, and they covered the story once it got into Congress and they got the briefing, and it was like clear that the story was 100%, correct. And I don't think the Times ever wrote anything.
No, I don't think so.
Not a word.
But I was just looking it up, and the Post did cover the what about in depth about about Feinstein, but I don't think the Times ever. Yeah, so
they just didn't do it, and I have no great insight. I mean, you always want these stories to get as wide a coverage as possible, and it's always surprising to me when things get picked up and when things don't, and. It's just part of the ecosystem, I think. I think institutions are having and have had a lot of complex and difficult conversations about how to cover Chinese espionage, especially in the environment surrounding the Trump administration. And you know what? Not Trump administration, really Trump himself, right? Because especially when you had COVID arise and you had folks just outright calling things like Kung flu, just obviously racist stuff, it just made it, I think people got skittish about certain kinds of coverage. And, we like to think as journalists that we can operate outside of that, larger social environment, and you just pursue the truth fearlessly. But in reality, that's just not true. As anybody who studied media coverage of the Iraq war and its run up can tell you, we are creatures of the countries that we live in, we are. And so there's a lot of negotiation that I think goes on as social conditions change, and then as political conditions kind of change as well.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I was just curious about that. I mean, I have my own biases where I think that they didn't do it because it reflected poorly on Democrats during an election term. But that I have nothing to prove. That's my own bias, and I recognize that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I have no insight into it. I think that look, the New York Times doesn't need me to defend it or decry it at all. It has plenty of resources and lots of very good journalists working for it. I think that, I think that resource decisions and decisions about what you don't cover is as important as decisions about what you do cover. Right. And it says a lot about those institutions. I don't think that there's necessarily a group of people who decide we're not going to cover any of this,
right.
Right. I think that you can look in hindsight and you could see about the kind of coverage that institutions, especially major and important institutions, provide at any given time, and get a good sense of the kind of the climate in those institutions. And again, the run up to Iraq and the way that the Times reported on Iraq and didn't report on Iraq, it tells you a fair amount. Or, I mean, James Risen, probably the preeminent investigative reporter of the Bush years. I mean, actually, to go back to your first question, I mean, Jack, like Risen and Risen's reporting on warrantless wiretapping and a bunch of Bush era covert action programs, for me was that shit was revelatory. I mean, it was such good and fearless journalism that it was this is what you can do. But Risen has written about this. He wanted to write about, he had the warrantless wiretapping story before the 2004 election. He had it buttoned up. He had the whole story. It could have literally pressed publish, or in those days, more people would have read it in Dead Tree edition, but still, it was done. It was there. It was ready to go. And the executive team at the Times dragged their feet. They're do more reporting. They're no, we have it. And they held it. They held it all the way through the election. And the only reason they published the story was because Risen threatened to publish it in his forthcoming book. They said, if you're not going to publish this story, I'm going to publish it in a book. And finally they relented and published it in the paper. I think they held it for over a year. It might've been 8 months, 9 months. I don't know the exact, but they held it for months and months and months. So, I'm not trying to say that institution is inherently more political than any other. They obviously do extraordinary work. I just think that those lessons are in hindsight, you see those things, and it's important for sophisticated readers who kind of to understand those kinds of stories and hear them, because you actually get a better sense of how these institutions work and don't.
Zach, I got to take a quick moment here to give a shout out to one of the sponsors of our show. It's Chill Boys. These are underwears made for men. They make super comfortable boxers and boxer briefs to keep the boys cool. Chill Boys boxers, they come in a couple different styles. They offer a relaxed fit bamboo and performance boxers, and their anti-chafing bamboo boxer briefs that are amazingly soft and breathable. Bamboo is much softer and cooler than cotton, of course. And for our listeners, you can go to their website, chillboys.com, and use the promo code TEAM15 to get 15% off on your first purchase. That's TEAM15 for 15% off your first purchase at chillboys.com.
Yeah, they're great. I've been wearing them. I love them. I mean, they're very, bamboo cotton is
gets
nice.
The endorsement.
It is. It really is. I love bamboo cotton, or bamboo. Do we need to do the other one right now? All right. Also, our other sponsor is 10,000 Clothing. Jack and I both love this company. We love their gear. 10,000 makes the highest quality, best fitting, and most comfortable training shorts. I mean, honestly, they're great shorts.
I wear their stuff when I work out all the time now, since they've sent us some shorts. Probably the best athletic shorts that I've ever owned.
The tactical short was developed and tested with over 50 special ops members, 51, 52, by test by rucking, swimming, lifting, and just all around beating it up. And the interval short is the most versatile style, perfect for gym days, spinning, short runs, high interval training, and backyard workouts. And they're also just really comfortable to hang out around the house. So check out 10,000. They have some really nice clothes. Their website is 10, spelled TEN, 1000.cc. That's 10,000.cc /team. For 15% off your purchase. Check them out, guys.
All right, so some other Zach Dorfman greatest hits here. You've also written about how during the Trump administration, cyber operations kind of took a more aggressive tone based on some reinterpretations of past authorities and such. Can you tell us about some of the work you did on that?
Yeah, so that was part of a really great team effort at Yahoo. And basically the story revealed that, there was a very bureaucratic process during the Obama years that went up to the NSC and interagency when they would decide to do offensive cyber operations. And if you viewed it more positively, folks would say that it was in order to ensure that there weren't, catastrophic unintended effects, right, of a cyber operation. And I think there's a reasonable argument to be made for that, because there's a question of when is something espionage? When is it an act of war? I mean, cyber just has all these kind of really complex and opaque aspects to them that were being worked out in real time, actually, by the Obama folks. And then there's another school of thought that it had gotten overly bureaucratic, hyper-lawyered, and by the time sometimes things actually got the go-ahead, they were no longer desirable. And so there was some work done within the Trump NSC to create a new covert action finding that would give the CIA more powers to launch cyber attacks or offensive cyber operations, I should say, because they're not covert action in cyberspace. That is the most precise way to say it. And I have to be precise here because this is one of those things where if I'm not, I'll be open to misinterpretation, and folks within the InfoSec community will have my head. This was kind of part and parcel of a bigger effort at CIA at the time, which was then led by Mike Pompeo, to bring everything down to the lowest possible decision maker. So it was it was meant to empower people to, decide to commit more, operational acts, basically, and to not have to kick everything up to the funnel at NSC. Again, a lot of folks within the community were excited about this. They thought it was really valuable. They thought that, the pace on stuff had been glacial in the Obama era, and they wanted to, do operations like the Directorate of Operations does. And, it's like, you're the DO, what are you going to do? That is the phrase that I've heard before. So this finding gave the agency the capabilities to do this, and they did. And they started conducting more covert action in cyberspace. And, if I recall correctly from the story, we identified not specific acts. Our sources would not say that specific document dump was, a CIA covert operation, but it was certain kinds of things.
You're talking about things like the Panama Papers?
Not actually those, although there's obviously been a lot of smoke around those for years. I have to be clear, I've never heard anything about the Panama Papers being a CIA covert operation. And if I had a reportable story on that, I would have reported it because that was, whether or not we did it, whether or not the CIA did it, Vladimir Putin thinks we did, right? So, no, it was more like hacking and dumping of Iranian banking data, those kinds of things. Again, I can't point to a specific leak because we weren't actually given, confirmation of a specific one. But, things like that, or the dumping of things related to Russia online in those years, like institutions that had nominal cover as private entities, but were in fact working for state entities. So, it's less sex. Some of it, it's less sexy. Everyone thinks about this from the perspective of Stuxnet, right? Things blowing up. And there was during the Trump era, there were a lot of things in Iran in particular that stopped functioning the way they were supposed to. And attribution has always been a little bit fuzzy about that. Although I've spoken to Trump administration officials that basically said, well, that was the Israelis. I mean, they literally said, we had conversations with the Israelis and we said, you go be the covert action arm, you go do that stuff, go with God, you have our blessings. So again, they didn't point to specific acts, but that's the general arrangement that I was aware of occurring during the Trump years. And that was pretty liberating, this idea though, that you could start to commit more hack and dumps, for instance, was considered an important evolutionary move for the agency. I mean, you have to also think about the time frame that we're talking about, right? So 2016 has just happened, right? There was just this, this hack and dump accompanying a Russian covert action campaign that was executed on U.S. soil, meant to affect the American political system, and it was incredibly successful, right? Like I don't think it's controversial at all to say that in terms of the expenditure and effort of the Russians, that campaign in 2016 was like a runaway success. So you have that going on, and then you have like a very bureaucratic process for the US, and you obviously have people within the agency who are they want to be unleashed, right? They want to be able to like do stuff that they're seeing their adversaries do to them with great effect. And so this covert action finding was developed and it was signed, and those authorities were put to good use. And that was a really, again, mostly still almost entirely in the shadows, but that was a kind of watermark, Trump era watermark in terms of covert action.
Let's talk. Well, no, before we start to get to that, let's first talk about the Soleimani story before we turn our focus and attention towards Russia and Ukraine, because I think you're reporting. Actually, we can follow a bit of a trajectory there. But let's jump over to Iraq and Iran and talk about the Soleimani strike. You and I worked on that article for Yahoo News about it. Why don't you kick it off and tell us about how that developed? I mean, I dug up some information. I mean, you really got some incredible details, I think, from the national security side.
Yeah, I mean, feels funny you asking me about an article that we co-wrote, that you were the primary author on. But I mean, I think, there was something that I think we discovered over the course of our reporting was both the tactical details of the strike itself, which I think was really interesting and revelatory, and then also the like larger context surrounding it, which is that the conversation around killing Soleimani went back to the earliest days of the Trump administration, and there was, the agency paramilitary folks were also tasked with thinking through potential modalities for killing Soleimani. And so you had these two tracks that were occurring. You had the folks at Special Activities Center thinking about ways to do this deniably under Title 50 and coming up with apparently some fairly elegant ways to do this, ways that would have hidden the hand of U.S. involvement. And, then you had what actually occurred, which was like a very big, bright, overt strike. And I think what our story revealed was the length of the process of deliberations over this that I think called into question to an extent the rationale that we were getting from the administration at the time about a kind of like new wave of a new campaign of chaos in the Middle East authored by Soleimani himself, because it was clear that this was an objective of the administration going back years. And, in our reporting, it was clear. Some folks said, no, there was something qualitatively different in what we were picking up from intelligence sources about what Soleimani was going to be doing. But there were other folks who, over time just basically said, I mean, yes, but also no. This was a policy objective. This was something that, we wanted to do. Soleimani had American blood on his hands, and we had the legal authorities in place to do it. And so we had an opportunity to do it, and we did it. It's interesting though, for an administration that was populated by many Iran hawks. I think they would describe themselves as that way. So I don't think I'm not describing them in a way that they wouldn't describe themselves, including folks like John Bolton, obviously, a longtime ultra Iran hawk. I had somebody recently say to me who was very involved in this process that they didn't believe until like 5 minutes before the strike happened that like it was actually going to happen and that Trump was actually going to give it the okay, because their interpretation was that Trump was equivocating a lot about it. You have to remember, he turned back that strike on Iran, right? I mean, mid-flight.
Right.
Like, I think he tweeted about it. He turned back the strike and then he tweeted about it and was like, I'm not going to do the strike. And so there was this sense that like he might get cold feet again. And so for the more hawkish Iran folks in the administration, I think up until the last minute, they weren't sure that it was actually going to go down, because they weren't sure if Trump was going to change his mind at the last minute again.
I thought one of the things, this is not in the article, but not really, but I think one of the things that I learned during the process was that this was part of a larger decapitation strike across 3 different countries. And from that perspective, the operation actually failed. However, the high value target number 1 definitely got taken out. That part of the operation was obviously a success. But in what they were trying to do across Yemen, Iraq, Syria, there were, as you recall, there were some airstrikes way later on Iranian targets inside Syria. And I always had to wonder, were those the targets they were after that night? And I was never really clear on why they weren't struck. The one in Yemen happened, but they missed the guy they were after. And then one of my sources told me that JSOC also hit a couple Shia militia targets in Baghdad that night. And that's never been reported anywhere other than in our article.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was one of those details that you're like, you want people to follow up on, right? You're like, because I think your framing was the way you're thinking about it is right. And I came around to that through, talking with you about it and then also reporting. I think the Washington Post first broke the Shalahi strike, the failed Shalahi strike in Yemen, but we confirmed it. Shalahi was on a target list for the USG for a long time because he was responsible for the explosively formed penetrator rat lines in southern Iraq in the mid-2000s. So he was like 100% responsible directly for like the death of US service people. And so I think people had wanted to get him for a long time, and he was and is an important operator because he got away. And I tried to get details on why that was and how he got away, and I kept hitting a brick wall. People just did not want to talk about it because they wanted to maintain more secrecy around it so they could get him again, in theory. Obviously, that opportunity did not come again for the Trump administration, or they didn't act on it. But I think, you have to look at the Soleimani strike in the perspective of the totality of the Iran policy of the Trump administration and maximum pressure, pulling out of JCPOA, the Iran deal, putting in place extremely punishing sanctions, designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and then the kind of covert dimensions to that, which we actually wrote about in that piece about covert action in cyberspace, which was this idea that there were these long-standing pre-existing findings involving Iran, including like a counterproliferation finding, and I believe a malign foreign influence finding that just date back, decades and decades, get updated, right? But like they're the general legal framework for, Title 50 activities against Iran, and they interpreted them very aggressively, right? And so it really became a kind of like implicit regime destabilization campaign where they couldn't say regime change, even though obviously folks within the Trump administration have been kind of proponents of it, very public proponents of it in different parts of their careers. But they didn't have the legal framework. They didn't get a signature, right, as far as we know, and as far as I was able to report, that actually just got a new finding that says go forth, do that, because there's a lot of like, there's a big hangover on regime change, right? I think it's like a very complex thing, and you've got to be very, very. Although Bill Clinton recently admitted to signing a regime change finding for Milosevic in the late '90s, which was pretty interesting. He just admitted that to like a reporter. He was like, "Yeah, I signed the finding," Like, okay, boss, sure, you were president, whatever. So I think the Soleimani strike was an attempt by the folks in that administration who were actually thinking, there were some, you may agree with their strategy, you may disagree with it, but there were some there were some folks who really thought very, very intently and hard about Iran policy and had a vision for it. And some of those folks had spent a long periods of their career thinking about Iran. And when they finally got into a position where they could affect Iran policy at very high levels, they were thinking about the different levers of power at their disposal. And I think, I can't speak for them, obviously, but I've spoken to a lot of them for a lot of hours about this kind of stuff, that the Soleimani strike was part of this larger strategy of weakening and destabilizing Iran. And it's too soon to tell, obviously, but the Iranians do not seem to be in a position of great strength right now either. And so, I mean, I will cop to something that I believed that has not come to pass. I mean, I thought the Iranians would strike more forcefully against the U.S. sooner after the Soleimani strike. And they did, of course, launch a bunch of missiles at a base in northern Iraq. And there were folks who got
a couple of different bases.
There were folks who got, I think, TBI, and like I don't want to understate the seriousness of it, but like I don't think a single American died in that strike, and there has not been much since then. I mean, there's been a little reporting. There's some reporting in the Washington Examiner about a plot on Bolton's life. In our story, we reported on a secret assassination list that the U.S. had gotten hold of this list that the Iranians had put together. But beyond that, you know, there was both no attempt at, for instance, like, I don't know. I mean, there was a lot of speculation at the time, and I thought it was completely reasonable given Iran's history that like somebody in Paraguay was going to get a car, you know, blown up coming out of an embassy or a consulate. You know, like they have a reach. Hezbollah also has a significant international reach in West Africa and South America. And, you know, I thought there would be a faster response. I'm very happy there hasn't been, but I'm also like, I don't expect them not to respond either. And because the US killed the second most important person in their regime. Right. And there hasn't really been anything close to a proportional reaction. And they are much weaker than we are as a country, but like, you know, there's an internal constituency for revenge, right? Like whether it's desirable or not for them to do it, there are many people within that in positions of power in that regime who I'm sure want retaliation to occur. And so on the one hand, I was wrong in thinking that they would respond faster, although, you know, history takes a long time to unfold. On the other hand, this like campaign of chaos in the Middle East that was the predicate for the Soleimani strike also has not come to pass, which is confusing because even if he was the executing authority on it as the leader of the Quds force, he himself would not be carrying out the campaign. So you would have thought that if they had had a campaign lined up in the Middle East and they were at the stages where they were going to be able to actually carry stuff off, that they would have even more reason to do it after Soleimani was killed. And we haven't seen that either. So it's a very muddy picture, but I think it's a really interesting one, especially now as they're trying to negotiate their way back into an Iran deal with the Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned though that there was like they were pretty diligent in their justifications for hating Soleimani. They put together like a list of every death and whatnot that he had been responsible for, right?
Yeah, I mean there seems to be some evidence that there was like in order to put together something like that, in order to justify killing somebody on the battlefield, you have to show them as an antagonist, right? And so I think there was sophisticated legal predication for it. I mean, I think we could spend hours and hours talking about like whether it was truly an active war zone, whether he was an active combatant, like he was there on a political trip. I think he was there to make different prominent Shia political parties kiss and make up. I think that's what it was. There was some kind of rift within the coalitions that Iran had influence over within Iraq, and he was there to deal with that. I mean, the other thing too is that, you know, nobody else talks about this, but like, there's another guy who was killed that night, Mohandas, and Mohandas was like a longtime Iranian agent who ran the Iraqi PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, and I mean, he was also responsible for external acts of terrorism too. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, Soleimani was such a big fish that like you have like somebody who in a different circumstance, we would only be talking about Mohandas because he was like such an important figure in Iraqi politics, and his relationship to Iran and external terrorism went back decades. I think it went back to like the early to mid 80s. So yeah, I mean, I think they got the predication they needed, but I think it's, you know, it brought us into like a different, like it was a really complex decision, and or at least it should have been, because you don't kill an opposing country's a general in peacetime, quote unquote, and a head of an intelligence agency without really thinking through the second and third order effects, right? I mean, we're in a moment where, Ukrainian forces seem to be killing a Russian one-star like every 2 days. But I mean, I'm not even exaggerating. It's almost like every day. I mean, it's unbelievable. But this was not that, right? This was a very, very different case than that. And I think it's within the Iranian system, Soleimani was far more important than any one of those particular one stars who the Ukrainians have killed, as important as those guys are. So, yeah, I think that story, like, I feel like this is going to be one of those stories that, like, we're going to look back on it. And the reporting that we did, Jack, like, we're going to be like, oh, that was chapter 1 out of like chapter 10. Yeah, it's just going to drag on for many, many years. And I think there could be a retaliatory cycle over many, many, many years that that I'm not sure how we're going to be able to get out of.
I mean, I was a fan of it then, and I understand the concern with second order and third order effects, but it's also for me, it was like, well, he's directly responsible for the death of U.S. Service people, and the IRGC was classified as a terrorist organization at the time, and had we not killed them, it's not like they would have eased up their operations against the U.S. You know what I mean? It's not like we initiated anything in my mind. And I felt like at the time, because we talked about it on a show when it was just Jack and I, when I guess we had somebody on at the time. But the idea at the time, I thought that the Iranians were kind of in a self-preservation mode, because if the Trump administration would make a move like that, then what else would they do? And how much, we're going to fire some missiles at al-Assad and someplace else, some rockets, to show that we're not laying down, but we're going to lay down. Like, we want to like represent the brand and the country, but we also don't want to, like, we've got the good life here in Iran as the, the leadership. We don't want to risk that. That was just kind of what I thought.
I mean, I think that's a completely coherent view. And I think that that was an argument that folks within the administration made to me. And I mean, part of it was like, look, the Iranians, people got too scared of the Iranians. They treated them like they were 10 feet tall, but they're not. Right. Like a regional adversary of the US that can cause hurt, but like, they just don't have the ability to strike us the way that people think. And we've let ourselves get into this cycle with them where we get paralyzed by not doing anything when they continue to push and push and push. And if we keep letting them push, they're going to push more. And, the example at the time was like, and is still today, is like, oh, well, first it was Lebanon, then it was Iraq, then it was Yemen, then it was Syria, right? So it's like there was this kind of like outward march of Iranian, either Quds Force folks or proxies, and there was more and more influence that they were accumulating in the wider Middle East. And I think there was a view of some folks in the administration that Soleimani was irreplaceable, right? He wasn't just some general, and other folks actually, interestingly enough, have tried to do the opposite tack, which is to be like, there's a myth of him, but he was just like any other general. Right. But it's funny because those two things come in tension. They're like completely in tension. I've heard antithetical views from folks that studied Iran or worked in the Iran space about this. But I would almost say that the first view has been borne out, which is that like Soleimani over 20 years built up absolutely critical interpersonal connections across the Middle East that were not replicable, and maybe he became a captive of his own power and didn't plan for his own demise enough to have other folks build those independent relationships with folks in all those countries that like were desperately needed, right, in case something like this ended up happening. So I would be fascinated today to get a sense of where they are, the post-Soleimani Quds Force. Yeah. It doesn't seem like they're ascendant. Yeah. Right? Like, you can empirically test this out at a point. He's been dead for a while, and they don't seem to be in a position of great strength regionally. So, it's not my job to make a judgment on it, but I think that the case in hindsight for doing what they did is probably stronger than I thought at the time. And, with the big caveat that like they waited many, many years. They've waited years before to carry out retaliatory strikes. Right. I mean, I think when Mughniyeh was killed, when was Mughniyeh killed? I don't remember when Mughniyeh was killed. 06?
Yeah, I don't remember. No. Yeah, something like that.
But Mughniyeh was killed, and then I think that Hezbollah blew up a bus of Israeli tourists like 6 or 7 years later in Bulgaria, right? As a retaliation for Mughniyeh being killed. Like, they will wait. And I guess the question is like, do they have the capabilities, or are they just like, because the allegations about the Bolton plot seem credible. And we know that they thought about like blowing up the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C., right? In Cafe Milano, right? Like the stuff that sounds like really harebrained, like they'll do it. And of course, there's a history in the 90s of, wholesale slaughter of civilians in Latin America, in Argentina, Jewish community centers and stuff like that. So, I think it's really interesting because I think analysts within, like CIA analysts working on Quds Force leadership have probably had a real sea change occur. And it will be interesting to see how their actions change or don't if the new Iran deal fails or not. Right. Like they might be like holding their fire, right? Like they might be trying to like play nice before until they get the deal, and then we'll like what their actions will be after the deal will really, I think, be pretty interesting.
The thing I wonder about stuff like that though is like, Iran was already committing acts, Hezbollah was already committing acts, and they can do a bombing in 7 years and claim that it was because of Soleimani, but were they going to do it anyway? It's one of those things that they can attribute it to whatever as revenge, but it's not like they weren't doing bombings prior to his death.
It becomes really difficult to to like suss it out.
Right.
I have no insight to it. Like, would they have bombed that bus of Israeli tourists in Bulgaria? Like, probably
Right.
not. I don't think so. I mean, what's the point? I mean, you're just creating international opprobrium and potential sanctions, and then you get like, and then you ratchet up tensions, and then your adversarial governments start thinking about like, oh, maybe we should blow up some more Iranian scientists, you know, and like it kind of empowers folks on both sides to pursue maximalist aims, and I don't know. I mean, it strikes me though again that they have been relatively. I mean, they're still. The Houthis are definitely have greater capabilities today. I mean, surprising capabilities, I think. But like overall, or maybe it's just because Syria has calmed down and frankly, Assad has won. So there's that too, right?
It'll probably happen on like the 5 or 10 year anniversary.
Yeah. And it's like, and I think folks need to be kind of ready for that. But I think we also, as a country, like our politics and our discourse has to prepare for if that occurs and if something horrific happens, that we actually like historicize it appropriately, right? Which is like, we might need to retaliate. I know, right? Yeah, it's like that'll happen. Like we may need to retaliate and we may have every right to retaliate, but like we have to have a discussion if they actually do try to like hit a senior American official that like, that they feel like they have every right to do so because we killed somebody who is like, again, there's no immediate analog, but we're talking about somebody who's like a super secretary of state. It would basically be like if you took the Dulleses and you put them together, you know, the guy who is like runs foreign policy and is the like chief spy master and also is like a general.
Yeah,
so I don't even, Eisenhower plus those, you know, I mean, it's like,
I mean, killing Soleimani, from my point of view, it's just business, right? He was just a target. You know, he was a thorn in our side, so we took him out. He was a military target. But if the Iranians turn around and they assassinate, you know, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, we're not going to sit back. America isn't going to think, well, that's business. You know, that's just a target. That's not how we will. That's not the context we will view it through.
I don't think so. That would be a very different country than the one that I think I live in.
Yeah.
And I don't want it to happen. I think that would be, you know, horrific and might set off a horrible escalatory spiral of violence. I mean, I think the AP had some good reporting actually about, I think, of an Iranian like discussion about hitting a very senior U.S. military official, maybe the Army Chief of Staff, I think. I have to go back and look at it, but there was some really good. I think it was Jim Laporta, the AP reporter, really good military reporter. And I think he had some reporting on this that I remember seeing at the time, being like, "Yeah, that sounds right." But I don't think we're going to situate it if it happens. It's interesting too. I mean, the point you're making is something that I hear. Like, I had a former senior agency official. Like, there are certain folks are very like matter of fact about this stuff, right? Like, and we were talking about the allegations of the bounties on U.S. personnel in Afghanistan, and he just said to me something along the lines of like, "That's business." Like, that's the way this stuff goes. Like, in the 80s, we were paying the Mujahideen. He was like, the Mujahideen was like ripping people's tongues out and like, you know, taking off their eyelids. You know, he was just kind of like, we set up an insurgency to kill their soldiers, and now they might be doing something like that to us. And it's a very like unvarnished and realist oriented take on this stuff. And it doesn't mean and people get like very up in arms when you talk about it like this. Yeah. And we're not talking in a moral register, you know, like it's just part of like the structure of how this plays out. And so it's good to have a realistic view about the things that your own side, quote unquote, does. So then you can try to put yourself in the position of the other ones and not moralize excessively about what an adversarial intelligence service is trying to do to you in a third country. And I think, there's the politics of it in Washington, D.C., and there was a lot of politics around the bounty story, if you guys remember correctly. I mean, it was just like everyone was up in arms. How could the Russians do this? And like, yes, is it bad? It is absolutely bad. Is it shocking? It's not shocking to me at all. And it really shouldn't be shocking to people who are getting classified briefings all the time about what we are doing to American adversaries around the world.
Right.
So that's just, I don't know. I think it's a healthier way to look at it.
I have a lot of skepticism about the Russian bounty story myself, but I'll shelve that discussion for another time. Let's circle around. Let's kind of make our way to Russia and ultimately to Ukraine here. Take us back in time to what was going on with the Trump administration and how we were talking a little bit beforehand about how publicly President Trump had this bromance going with Vladimir Putin that was a little concerning. Yeah. But as far as the policy objectives of the Central Intelligence Agency and other facets of the U.S. government, it's like fairly, hawkish, leaning into the problem as far as, Russian espionage and Russian influence is concerned. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like the great untold narrative of the Trump administration, which is that you had two foreign policies. You had the president's foreign policy. See, people can never say this, or people in the administration can never say this at the time, because it sounds like subversive, but it's true. This is absolutely true. It's true. And the truth is that the Trump administration was populated by traditional hawkish center-right national security folks that were more aggressive than the Obama administration on a whole variety of topics, including Russia-related ones. And then you had the president himself who, like you said, had this bromance. There was there was just so much heat around anything he said or did regarding Russia that it became impossible to actually get a good sense of the administration's Russia policy, because it was always being filtered through the discourse surrounding Trump himself. And it was basically impenetrable, right? There was a point where the Trump administration even would do overt things. They would, to talk about Ukraine for a second, I mean, they're the ones that started providing lethal aid, right? And but it was impossible. It couldn't break through, that they were stepping things up, And
I think it's interesting that someone I spoke to about the Javelin program, that they finally did get that approved during the Obama administration. But I was told that when Trump came in, he was very quick to say, "Oh yeah, that guy was too weak to do it, but I'm the guy. I sent the javelins." But there was a continuity, though. I mean, that much is true. Trump continued.
Yeah, he can. I mean, two things. One, the way to get, I've heard this before, and this has been reported by others, the way to get something done was to be this is the opposite of what Obama did. So it was Obama was weak on this, and you will be strong. And so then he'd be what is that? What do you want me to, where do you want me to sign? More missiles? Sure. I'm stronger. And it was less about the particular policy and more about the emotional frisson of separating himself from Obama. And I think you correctly identified, though, the Obama administration began post 2014 policy in Ukraine was, the Obama administration were they were the ones who really thought about the parameters of it at the time. And they, the overt training program in Western Ukraine that trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers over the years, and only was put on pause in February of this year when the invasion seemed imminent. That was began under the Obama administration, and so were the CIA's covert action programs in Ukraine. And there was a tremendous fear within the Obama administration, I was told, about seeming too aggressive, even though the Russians had literally just annexed Crimea and were supporting an insurgency in the Donbass. But like there was a lot of fear. I had a former national security official say to me, and I never forgot about this phrase, and he said, well, the Obama administration deterred itself all the time, and they did that on Russia and Ukraine. Like they talked themselves into a corner where they were too worried about appearing too aggressive. And I don't know if this was a direct reaction to it. It may have had nothing to do with it, but so they had this overt program which began pretty quietly, and they did something which many administrations do when they want to pursue foreign policy, but not actually have to explain it to the American people for a variety of reasons. And they kicked up some covert training programs as well for the Ukrainians, both on the front line in the Donbass and then also in the U.S. itself. And they sent multiple classes of folks, Ukrainian paramilitaries and intelligence personnel, to a training center beginning in 2015. That was run by CIA Special Activity Center folks, and they just sent classes through. And to kind of bring this all back again, that program was expanded and given more financing during the Trump era, right? So once again, there was like this public-facing aspect to Trump, which was like standing at that podium with Vladimir Putin and denigrating the U.S. intelligence community and like just some stuff that's like, it's fair to say unprecedented, just like weird, stuff that like is disquieting. And then at the same time, his administration is like kicking up more money for, programs that involve having paramilitaries teach other paramilitaries skills that could be construed as designed to kill Russians on the battlefield, right? So like sniper training, for instance. So it's like a tale of two administrations, right? It's like a very, very complex situation that you don't see a lot because you don't get a situation where like, the Biden administration is far more normal in that way, right? Or like where I don't think Biden is saying one thing and his administration is like in the NSC, they're just like, we're just going to keep doing this, like, and that was going on during the Trump era. And, but the program, the CIA programs, seem to have been very, very successful. Just like the training in Western Ukraine appears to have been very successful too. I think there's, like, it seems to me that there's night and day between the Ukrainian military in 2014 and the Ukrainian military in 2022. And I think vast credit has to go to the Ukrainians for their like perseverance and bravery. But 8 years of training by the U.S. military and Special Activities Center definitely didn't hurt. So
yeah, that's always, it's always interesting. Like, where do you draw that line? There's always, we'd always want to like try to take credit and be like, oh yeah, look what a good job we did. But maybe it has more to do with what badasses the Ukrainians are and being willing to fight. But as you said, there are some metrics we can look at, right? If you look at the amount of armored vehicles that the Ukrainians are destroying with American and British weaponry, it seems that, yes, this training did pay dividends.
Yeah, it was train the trainer too, right? Because it was like training them in, anti-tank stuff, right? And giving them the wherewithal to figure out how to use those tools. And now those tools are like, that stuff, those types of missiles and systems are like, they're like constantly flowing into Ukraine, right? And you need those guys who understand how to operate them and then can train other people to do it. And then you also have just like intelligence collection techniques, again, sniper operations. Like they basically taught, they taught the Ukrainian special operations folks like the American way of special operations and the American way of war. And, I think you correctly identified that it's like important not to overstate it. Because what is it like? Victory has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. And like right now, the Ukrainians are doing way better than people initially thought. So folks want to take credit for it, and like some should, right? Again, 8 years of training is 8 years of training. And again, I don't want to draw too close of a line because I don't know this for a fact, but like How many 1-stars have the Ukrainians killed at this point? They've killed at least 1 2-star, right? At least one of those folks was reported to have been killed by a sniper. Like, there's enhanced intelligence sharing that's going on. We know that. I mean, the Biden folks have just come out and said it, but I reported on it that those relationships have developed big time after 2014, and the ability to identify leadership and take them out on the battlefield like that is again, I'm just a reporter, but those are precisely the kind of things that I was told that the agency was teaching them how to do. Mm-hmm. So, without saying this is because of the agency, and I don't know that, this is the kind of thing that I was told they were taught. And it seems to be having an effect today because it's frankly shocking what you're seeing right now.
Yeah.
And at least it is to me.
I mean, along with the conventional American military and the Office of Defense Cooperation out of the embassy there, and in NATO, I mean, there were a number of NATO nations who were in there helping out and were given different lanes and training the Ukrainians. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it definitely paid dividends. I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, I mean the training at I think Yavoriv was the name of the facility. Like you said, published a story today with John Winter that was based on an unclassified 2016 report by was folks representing the Irregular Warfare Center, which I think has been disbanded now, but and it was all about They interviewed folks from the 1st Battalion that were trained there by the Americans and the Lithuanians and the Canadians, who then went back to the front in the Donbass, and then they brought them back to be like, well, how did the training help? How did the training help? How did the training help? And they were all just for instance, NATO style coordinate finding, and I forget the name of the precise system. They were talking that up. They were talking up the sniper training. They were and I don't think they were just trying to, they seemed actually very, very grateful and thankful for what they had learned. I mean, they were also we need night vision equipment. Right. We're lacking basic things. Some of our tents date back to World War II. I mean, this is literally, they were telling these American soldiers this, we need stuff that's we need spare parts, but it's clear that it was having an effect. But it was interesting though too, because it was they had to learn, and the U.S. helped them think through an environment where they were being outmatched technically, by the Russians, and they didn't have the ability to have the Russians and the separatists had loitering, ISR drones that made it impossible for them to move at certain times. And they're using the drones for pinpoint artillery strikes, and this was just stuff that was really, they were learning through that in real time with their American trainers, both in the regular military and then the CIA SAC guys. And I know this for a fact on both. And then there was kind of an iterative process where for the US, this was unbelievably valuable because it was you're getting direct experience and or exposure to people that were fighting Russians and learning about the Russian way of war in real time. Right. And so then those folks would go back and they would think through how to overcome these problems that the Ukrainians were facing on the front. And so over time, I mean, it was a big shock. I mean, I could tell you, I was speaking to former folks who were, aware of these programs on the front line, the SAC program on the front line, and they were, after a decade plus of war on terror type stuff, they were whoa, we haven't faced an adversary like this. We don't know. It was kind of like Moscow rules times Baghdad rules. Mm-hmm. And so they were shocked at what they were seeing. They were oh, we can't do certain things the way we've done them before. We have to change the way we've done comms. We have to change the way we operate in the battle space because of the ability for the Russians to target us in ways that we just never had to worry about with the Taliban. I mean, there was one anecdote I was told about the Russians shining high intensity lasers into sniper scopes and trying to blind people, and the SAC folks were well, never saw that shit with the Taliban, you know, like it was like an ice water bath for them. And so they learned in real time, and then they learned and taught at the same time with the Ukrainians. And I think that's the other thing that hasn't really gotten a lot of attention, is the length of time that they had with them there, because it allowed them those multiple cycles to just keep learning about what the Russians were doing and to think of countermeasures for it. And you're probably seeing some of the fruits of that today.
I can't remember if you mentioned it in your article or not, but there's also some training to like help them electronically mask their signatures so they weren't being targeted and things like that.
Yeah, exactly, because they were like taking their cell phones into the trenches and like getting blown to bits, you know, in the early days in 2014. They didn't understand the signature. They didn't understand that their signatures were leaving them as like sitting ducks out there. So they had to find new covert communication systems that both allowed them to communicate with one another, but also didn't leave just like metadata, right? That allowed them to be targeted. And it's amazingly ironic, right? Because there's been all this reporting that the Russians are getting smoked because their generals are just using open lines to communicate with folks either back home or in the battlefield. And so the stuff that the Russians were doing to the Ukrainians in 2014, and the Ukrainians and their U.S. trainers learned to protect against, the Russians seem to now be doing. And it's really fascinating because it shows that like the Russians were really excellent at like more static situations where there was like kind of like a relatively static line of, they don't call it line of control. What is it? The line of contact, where they had positions and they had material and that allowed for like electronic warfare, and they were able to do this kind of ISR work. But as things have taken on a much more dynamic flow in the current invasion, they just seem to be like sputtering. It will be interesting though if they settle in and we start seeing a kind of Donbass situation in different parts of Ukraine, whether that will revert. And then it will be particularly interesting to see whether the lessons that the US and the Ukrainians learned and the things that the US taught the Ukrainians become extra relevant.
It's pretty incredible. I mean, we're living through historic times here, watching all this unfold in front of us.
I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because we're living on all this stuff real time, right? We don't know the ending of something while we're in the middle of it. But like, this is just one of those events that like could easily be as epochal as 9/11 was, or if not more. And we're just like, we're now in this moment where we don't really know where we're going to land, but we all know that things are never going to go back to the way they were before they did this, right? You cannot launch a massive invasion, a land war in Europe like this without reverberations for years and decades. I mean, Russia is being disengaged from the global economy, is being like ripped from the global economy in the last like month. You have a refugee crisis in Europe, but you also have like reportedly tens of thousands of Russians from the like middle class and intelligentsia fleeing the country, right? So like Russia's not going to be the same either, and not just in material terms. Like there was always this kind of give and take in the Russian system where it was authoritarian, but there were still far more freedoms in a lot of ways than under the Soviet system, where if you wanted to find external sources of media, or there was like certain kinds of like dissenting or quasi-free publications that existed, and that stuff just got shut down. It just in 48 to 72 hours, the cliche is that like a curtain descended, right? over Russia. And like, we just do not know where this is going. And we really don't know where Russia can or cannot like de-escalate in a way that's like politically salient for the leadership there, right? Because they need to like back off in a way where they can somebody can live to tell the tale at this point.
I think we saw a little bit of that today with the Russian military briefing, where you can already see them starting to move the goalposts and saying, well, it was never our intent to take these cities. It was just a distraction so we could come in from the, like, it's like, yeah, we meant to do that, you know.
Yeah.
So I think,
mean, just
yeah.
That's just fucking bullshit. I mean, like, I don't know how else to put it. Like, that is such bullshit. They wanted to decapitate the country in 48 hours. They wanted to kill the leadership. Like, they wanted to install a puppet government. It is, I mean, that is incredibly obvious. And I mean, but in a way, like, if they want to change their stated objectives, that's actually good.
Right. Let them.
Right. We should let them. I mean, if they do, then we should like confirm that, yeah, that's what you guys meant the whole time.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not going to stop them from trying to level Mariupol,
right,
you know, or take other cities in the Donbass. But like, that's a better rhetorical framework for everybody to be operating in, because the Ukrainians are winning the war, but the Russians can win by losing. They can just throw people into pressure for a long time, and they have a history of doing it. And the Ukrainians are going to have to come away from this conflict with, like, they're going to lose things, right? Like, no matter what, even they're going to win the war, but as the weaker party, they're going to lose a great deal, and not just in people's lives. Like, they're going to lose territory, they're going to lose claims. Like, they're not going to get everything that they want, and it's going to be interesting to see where they can find that middle space that is politically palatable, though, also to the Ukrainians, because Zelensky has to go back to his people and be like, you guys, I mean, he has to go back to a people that has been transformed by this war, that has lost so many people, civilians and soldiers alike, and sell them on something that they're going to be able to live with. And that's going to be really hard too. Plus, frankly, I think there's a situation where foreign governments that are supporting the Ukrainians, like, nobody wants the war, but also, like, the Ukrainians are dying and other people aren't dying. The Ukrainians are doing tremendous damage to the Russian military right now. And so it'll be interesting to see what Ukraine's partners actually think is a advisable deal. Or whether they'll be encouraging folks to push on in the face of, like, Russian losses.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm curious about is you mentioned sort of the xenophobia that resulted against, like, the Chinese and COVID, and then also, you know, when there are spies caught, and the xenophobia that affects regular, like, Chinese. We're kind of seeing the same thing with Russians in the United States, though, right? We're seeing Russians, you talk about kicking Russians out of school. Like, do you have an opinion as to whether that's an adequate response of like punishing Russians in general for this? Or do you feel is it's more that kind of xenophobia rearing its head?
So it's interesting, right? Because, like, you know, collective punishment is a really delicate topic. Sanctions are a form of collective punishment. Nobody wants to say that, but they are, right? You're like punishing people who are living in that country who have nothing to do with the government for their government's actions. I mean, that's what's been going on in Iran for a long time. And that's what's been going on in Russia right now. I mean, just to be totally frank with you, like, I don't think that kind of xenophobia is anywhere near as acute, because, like, Russians are white, most of them. I mean, the Russian Federation is a multi-ethnic state, but I just think that, like, just like the difference between the treatment of the Japanese Americans and German Americans in World War II, there was, like, a massive, massive double standard. And I think you're going to see that play out. There's going to definitely be some bias against Russian institutions. But the other thing too that people, like, need to really, really keep in mind is that, like, many Russian Americans in the U.S. came here at the fall of the Soviet Union or before it. It's like many people who, like, there was actually a segment in local news in San Francisco about this, where, like, we have a part of town that's called Little Russia, and there's really good bakeries and other stuff. And, like, all those folks have, like, you know, they have stuff like Russia is in the name of the restaurant, but they, like, came from Ukraine in, like, 1983.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And, like, I think you have to be very, very careful with that kind of thing, because, you know, Russian identity is so complex, and people who were Soviet like Soviet Americans identify, like they have things that say they're Russian, but it's like, it's a lot more complicated than that. And you just don't see a lot of like, I mean, I haven't seen any, maybe you could tell me about what's going on in New York, but within that community, you don't see a lot of any outward pro-Putin sentiment. Quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah, I saw on a Russian restaurant in Manhattan yesterday or a couple of days ago, Ukrainian flag very prominent out front.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and here in Brooklyn, I've seen a lot of Ukrainian flags on just general businesses and outside people's windows and things like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I mean, they this is like really a fraternal war too. I mean, that's what makes it so devastating, I think, for both Ukrainians and Russians who have, and we have to give a lot of credit to the Russian people that came out to protest this war. It's balls. It's not an easy place. Yeah, it's ballsy. You got, right. You do not want to, and especially now that it's basically a crime to even call it a war, right? Protesting in the streets in an authoritarian country, we take that for granted here. We take for granted how hard it is to, mobilize people in a place like that. But I think it's devastating, right? I'm sure it's devastating for Russian American and Ukrainian American communities too. I mean, in New York, right? You have Brighton Beach. They used to call it Little Odessa, and like I'm sure there are so many devastated families right now that thought of themselves as like, either have family in Russia, come from one side of the border, the other side of the border, always thought of themselves as like twin peoples in many ways. And now it's like, now that's being ripped apart. So I think, in many ways, this is like a time almost to like go support those businesses and to let people know that like, you're not associating them with Vladimir Putin.
Right.
That said though, my brother who lives in New York, he has like a Soviet American trainer who is like mainlining RT and is convinced that Ukraine is being denazified. So,
Yeah, we definitely have those people out there who they've been mainlining QAnon and they think that all kinds of crazy stuff. They think Zelensky is blowing up his own cities and like weird shit.
Yeah. Well, is it a shock? Look at the text that Ginny Thomas sent, like people get radicalized, right? People just like fly off the handle with theories. And it's like Vladimir Putin's talking about canceling Russia, right? Like,
yeah.
Troll or does he actually believe it? Like, I don't know anymore,
Yeah. What did he say that like they're canceling Russia? Like they, or something to do with J.K. Rowling's.
Yeah,
they're canceling me like the way they canceled her. Did the Harry Potter woman invade Ukraine? What the fuck are we talking about?
It's like literally the most insane. It's insane to have the leader of Russia, one of the world's most powerful states, that is in the middle of a brutal military invasion of a neighbor, talking about J.K. Rowling and cancellation. Like it's just like you couldn't possibly make it up.
But that's a message that's tailored for Americans. And for the West. It's for the West. It's not for his people.
No, it is. I don't know. Maybe they love Harry Potter in Russia. I have no idea. But like, but again, I don't know. If you had asked me years ago, is this all rhetorical? I'd been like, oh yeah. But then like listening to Putin's, rant before the invasion about his reasoning process for going in, I was kind of like, he might actually believe all this stuff, you know? And that's more scarier.
I think that's one of the challenging things about this is, it's hard to tell what his actual mental state is right now, in terms of like predictability. We say like, well, what's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario right now where we are? And it's like, it depends on where he's at and, mentally and everything like that. Like, will he revert to, chemical warfare? Will he revert to nukes? Like what, how much of a threat can he find? Can he find a way out that is going to allow him to preserve his leadership? Because if he's not the leader of Russia, he's probably either going to jail or going to be dead. And if that's his only option, who knows what he would be willing to do.
I think that's well put. I mean, he's got to satisfy his core constituency, right? Which is like a very small circle of folks in the security sector who, many of whom are reportedly like to his right, right? Like that's why the whole conversation around like, oh, somebody should, I couldn't believe that this was done, but like a U.S. senator actually was like suggesting like somebody should take out, Putin.
Oh, it was Lindsey Graham, wasn't it?
Yes, it was Lindsey Graham. Who actually I think was like, I think Marjorie Taylor Greene actually tweeted at him and was like, "Are you crazy? you can't talk like this," And I was kind of just like, once again, truth is like stranger than fiction. And like, I think we have to see Putin as somebody, like we mirror image terribly, right? Like we think about social and political pressures as reflected from the American context, which is entirely different than the Russian context, right? Like when you have a robust free press, when you have some semblance of a multi-party, we have a multi-party system, and you have like a somewhat robust accountability mechanism that's quite deficient in a lot of ways, but is also like it exists and it's real and it's important. And of course, you have like electoral democracy, right? Like we have none of that in Russia right now, right? And you have somebody that's been in power for 20 years and an ever smaller circle of people that he trusts, who has become increasingly remote from people that apparently he even was fairly close to, in 4 or 5 years ago, and became extra remote during COVID, and seems to have been very actually emotionally and intellectually influenced by a particular theory of Russian history that emphasizes certain kind of like mystical elements and a story about grievance in the post-Cold War, in the post-Soviet era. And like, we don't know. I think we have no idea what he's going to be willing to do to exit the war on terms that he considers appropriate for himself, for his country, but also, again, like you said, for himself. Because like I don't think there's a situation, I could be wrong, I hope I'm wrong. I don't think there's a situation, well, I don't know if I hope I'm wrong either way in this, but like, I doubt there's a situation in which he resigns and goes and lives in a dacha somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, he's either in it till he's dead, like he sits in that seat until he dies of old age, or something else horrible happens to him at this point. And then beyond there, we have no idea,
Zach, I'm going to hit up some viewer questions here. Robert asks, do you have any info on inter-DNR, LNR factional fighting from 2014 to now? Any info on what has happened to their top brass once they moved to Russia, like Gherkin?
Oh, that's a great question, and that's more specific than I think I can provide. I mean, all I know is that there was I can say that like, and I think some of this has been reported elsewhere, but like there was a period in which you had folks in the initial post-war period, you had folks enter Ukraine with the approval of the Russians, who are kind of irregular forces like Cossacks and other. There were other like extremist groups that then started carving out these little kind of principalities within the DNR and LNR. And there was a regularization campaign that occurred when the Russian military came in, and the FSB started like hunting some of those folks down for thinking that they actually had independent decision-making powers. Like I think there was one guy a Cossack leader, who was killed in a car bomb the day after his wedding or something like that. And so I think over time, those more marginal elements were either silenced, or they were kicked out of the LNR and the DNR and sent back to Russia. Or alternatively, I was told some of them were basically told, you're not in a leadership position, but you're not coming back to Russia. Like, this is your new home. So not a great deal for those folks, but then again, they were pretty terrible folks to begin with. So like, I have no empathy for them whatsoever, but I don't know what's happened since then. And I don't know what's happened since the war broke out. The the eastern front of the LNR and DNR, like that line seems fairly static, although the Russians seem to have taken some territory north of there. But I'm not sure what happened to those guys, the ones that survived, although it doesn't seem like after 2016 or so, I was told they lost their influence. Like their influence spiked in the immediate post-war period, and then it dropped pretty quickly once the Russians decided they wanted to exert more control.
Elliot asks, Western media suggests that Russia is only using 10% of their available forces. To me, that seems like BS. Why use 10% if the goal is a blitzkrieg? What are your thoughts?
10% of their available forces? 10% of all the forces that were arrayed at Ukraine from Belarus?
I think he means 10% in terms of the totality of the Russian military.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, I think you don't want to leave yourself completely undefended in other parts of your vast empire that stretches from the border of Norway to North Korea. That would probably be the number one reason, right? You're already taking troops out of like Vladivostok and the Far East, and you probably don't want to leave yourself too vulnerable in different parts of your absolutely massive country. I mean, I think
can't find them.
Yeah, my understanding is that 90% of all the forces that they had arrayed, either in Belarus or on the border, they have brought to bear. I don't know. I don't know and cannot say whether that's I don't have the statistics in front of me about the percentage of those forces and what they represent for the Russian military writ large. But you guys might know better than I. So maybe, I mean, please feel free to chime in there.
Yeah, no, I don't know either as far as what percentage. I mean, they're probably, like you said, they're probably deploying every available force without, leaving themselves completely undefended in, Kamchatka or wherever else they have.
Yeah, I don't know. They don't want like the Japanese to be like, oh, cool, maybe we'll.
Yeah, right.
We'll start that up again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Florida Nick, thank you very much. He just had jean shorts. K-Jam, thank you. Counterintel stories are very difficult to cover for mass audiences. The NRA Maria Butina infiltration equals so blatant, yet it was not well covered, in my opinion. I mean, do you agree with that counterintel stories are hard to cover and not reported on often?
Yes, counterintelligence stories are really hard to cover because they tend to be very closely held for a variety of reasons, and they also tend to go on for long periods of time, and sometimes that, like, without that quick obvious beginning and an end to an investigation, it kind of robs folks of the ability to say that's done now, so now I may talk about that to a reporter that I trust, because there's a sense that these things will go on for like 30 years and they'll take on all these crazy dimensions and they'll spin out in all these directions. They're also not understood that well. And you have to kind of get into this, you have to get people into this like language space where I think they understand the like multi-level games that are being played. I would actually say the Butina story is like a counterexample to that, though. I think the Butina story was covered extensively because it was salacious. Yeah. I mean, she was sleeping with a lobbyist, right? Was associated with the NRA.
I think so. Yeah, she was a lifetime member of the NRA, and
was she the one that we got to see her boobs in the Daily Mail? Or am I thinking?
I don't know, but that sounds very plausible. You might be confusing her with Anna Chapman.
Yeah.
I mean, here's the thing, though. Let's be honest. Like, she's kind of like a lesser version of Anna Chapman. Like, Anna Chapman was actually an SVR officer undercover. Like, she was an illegal. And like Maria Butina was being run not even by an intelligence agency. She was an agent of influence being run outside of like normal intelligence agency channels, I think. But she was also everywhere, right? She's a good, for instance, the Christine Fung story, people were like, oh, this is kind of like a Chinese version of Maria Butina. That was the easiest way for me to explain to people about why that story mattered and what it was about. I was like, yes, this is like a Chinese version of Maria Butina, except for local Bay Area politics.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That story was all over, but anything that had Russia influence, I mean, at that period, it was going to get tons of play. And I
Right.
think it got
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the New York Times wrote at least 10 to 15 articles about that. But again,
tons.
And from my own personal bias, and this is not fact, like where I see it, it's like, well, it's politically oriented. Well, they will write about a Russian asset with the NRA, but not about a Chinese asset with Democrats. But that again is me and how
Yeah, I mean, didn't the New York Times just do that whole story about how Biden's laptop was legit?
they just put it out.
I mean, doesn't seem like something they would do if they're just trying to like run top cover and that's their main.
Well, unless you look at it from the point that everybody denied it during the election and now it's safe to admit it, like that they ran top cover during the election,
Or they didn't have the information. I mean, this gets into like conspiracy theories.
I mean, it's all
stuff too quickly
speculation,
for
right?
me.
And we see it the way we sort of lean.
I don't think it's conspiratorial either way. I think there's very plausible arguments on both sides in this case, where it's like you could make a case that it was because it wasn't adequately corroborated before the election, or that like it was just such a third rail that nobody wanted to touch it until after the election, and then people felt safe.
Yeah, and I honestly couldn't say. I don't know.
Yeah. Again, it's. I think that it's very hard. I know for myself, it's very hard to look past my cognitive bias, and all I can do is recognize that I have it and wonder how much it's influencing, like what I see and what I read.
I mean, if I were to just think about it from like a basic like civics aspect, I mean, that's really how you have to. I mean, that's the best way to read too. I mean, read critically. I mean, read sources critically that have an editorial bias that align with you, and read them equally as critically on the opposite side, right? And this gets very, very third rail-ish again, but like, editorial is one thing, news reporting is another. They're supposed to be church and state separation. It's a little more complicated. It can be a little more complicated.
Right. And there's nuance. I mean, there's nuance to almost every story, but it doesn't support neither. I feel as though like the left or the right media channels are not going to cover the nuance because it complicates the issue. They want a message that's marketable to their viewers, and so generally they're going to go with the story in a way that doesn't express nuance.
I think this is this is one of the great problems of journalism, right? Which is like getting eyeballs in non-sensationalistic ways to make people care about stories that matter, but that are presented in ways that are not going to set people's like seats on fire. And I am so glad I don't cover American domestic politics. You could not pay me any amount of money to cover American domestic politics for precisely that reason, because I just think it's really, really hard to do so in that way. And you're just in such a pressure cooker. But I will say, and like, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure other national security reporters would say the same thing. It's like, you're also thinking about that. You have to report the facts. You just have to report the facts. But like, again, the stories don't appear in vacuums, and we're humans.
Right.
Like, we're aware of the environment that is occurring in the political and social and cultural environment that we are immersed in. And so like we think through that stuff. That doesn't mean that I've never not reported something for that reason, but like I'm aware of it.
Right.
Like I was very aware when I was reporting the Christine Fung story that like this was going to be construed a certain way, but like to the marrow of my bones, I was like, this is a story that matters and it should be reported. And like, that's it. And it was kind of like, damn the torpedoes. And I mean, that's just the way it was.
I think it's very admirable. I mean, I think that, everybody's going to have their view of the world, but for you and for Jack and for people working in the journalism field, like the truth is the truth. Yeah.
I mean, you have to, at the end of the day, like if you're like, that's the difference between you and a propagandist, right? Like if you're an actual journalist, you have to kind of like follow the facts. I mean, this sounds very like, I don't know, gumshoe or idealistic but I think it's true. Like you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable in the things that you're learning. even if you know that they somehow contradict things that you believe or you previously believed deeply, because you have to be willing to update your ideological priors in real time.
Right.
And that is like an uncomfortable and sometimes painful thing for people to deal with.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I don't like. Yeah.
User questions.
Thank you again, KJM. What is your understanding regarding the motivation of Chinese spies versus Russian spies in the U.S.? The government claims intellectual property, DoD info, and social chaos.
I mean, definitely like IP theft is a big part of Chinese strategy. It's been theft of trade secrets has been like a huge concern for FBI counterintelligence. The Chinese are the biggest practitioner of that domestically. I think it's actually an interesting question whether the Russians being cut off from the global market are going to start getting back in that game more, and whether counterintelligence folks are going to have to start thinking about that, because the Russians were involved in it in very, very small, specific areas like microchips and night vision devices and stuff like that. But the wholesale kind of like, pilfering of American IP across a bunch of different sectors and industries that the Chinese are have been known to do in the past, like that, we haven't seen that with the Russians the same way. Yeah, I mean, I would break it down as IP theft, political influence, and community influence campaigns, right? Like American influence in the American political system as one prong, and then influence and surveillance of communities of Chinese descent and Chinese communities abroad in the U.S. And that's a big part of what they've been up to. I mean, traditionally there was this idea that they weren't as like slick as the Russians, that they were a little bit more like second tier, and they were like, but it was just that they were willing to get caught more because they just had more people they had more agents that they were willing to like burn in a way. And the Russians, I was always told the Russians are more like us, like they're more intelligence officer focused. The Chinese will get people to do things, like people from state institutions or universities to do IP theft for them, or people in graduate programs who will, learn about important technologies that then they can bring back to China and then participate in some kind of like state laboratory that basically replicates the research that they did in the US. And it's just a different strategy, a different way of looking at things. And the Chinese, I think, were just willing to throw more at the wall and see what's stuck.
Yeah, it's crazy. Let's see here. Robert, thank you. Oh, let's see. No, Michael, thank you. What are your thoughts on after the Ukraine war is done? How do you think payback for Russia on U.S. for arming the Ukraine will and could take shape?
Oh boy, that feels like I have no idea where we're going to be at that point. I don't know. I mean, I think that like if the U.S. is involved abroad, the U.S. is still involved abroad, but like if we had another conflict zone like Afghanistan where we had significant personnel abroad, I would expect to see more targeting of them, and probably through proxies. I mean, I think, although I have to be honest, I think that they have so many internal problems right now that they're going to have to deal with. Yeah. Both their military and intelligence services, I think, are going to have. There's probably going to be purges and, kind of self-laceration that's going to go on. The analytic core is going to be put through the ringer for the, potential predictive errors in the ease of the invasion that I don't know. I mean, I think this is going to leave Russia weakened in any case. And I don't think this is like, I don't think revenge on the U.S. is going to be their top concern. They're going to probably turn inward. And we've been very open. That's the thing, right? I mean, other than these like relatively small agency programs that I've reported on, I mean, like Milley just appeared at the border and he brought a bunch of journalists with him like a week and a half ago. And they like literally wrote up articles that were like, Milley's at the border, like, slapping, like, basically like just like watching the stingers roll off the trucks. Right. So, I mean, the U.S. has obviously calculated that, that Russia has bigger problems right now than retaliation against the US or all of NATO. That's the other thing too. Retaliation against the US, but it's NATO wide.
Right.
And like NATO is an incredibly powerful military alliance. Like we really don't think about, I mean, we take it for granted, but like this is not, the US gives top cover to the smaller countries, but this is like a mass armament campaign from multiple countries, and not just NATO countries, but also I think the South Koreans and the Japanese have also lended a hand too. So this is like a lot of different countries all over the globe who have come firmly down on the side of the Ukrainians, and the Russians, I don't think they could do much about it right now.
Florida Nick, thank you. A little political comment. Biden gave more equipment to the Taliban than Ukraine. Robert C., thank you very much. Thoughts on difference on Ukraine's SBU's corruption and effectiveness from Poroshenko years to current president?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that one of the giant impediments for U.S.-Ukrainian corruption, U.S.-Ukrainian relations has been the sense that the SBU is both very corrupt and very penetrated. Those things are intertwined and interrelated, but they're not synonymous, right? So they have really, that's been a big deal. Over the years, apparently, it's gotten better. It's still a problem. And there's inter-service rivalry there too, where you have the Ukrainian military. I mean, I was told by former officials the Ukrainian military intelligence agency, HER, was actually considered more reliable and less penetrated than the SBU. And so there's been really strong NSA HER liaison since 2014. But the agency also has built up important links with the SBU, and the way that it was carried out, according to the folks that I spoke with, former officials, was that they would try to isolate specific trusted units and commanders and compartment them from the larger SBU organization. But all that said, I can tell you that during the Trump era national security officials that were in close contact with those folks had a rule. And the rule was, don't tell anything to the SBU that you don't expect the Russians aren't going to find out. Like, they're going to find out about it, like SBU is that penetrated. And there was this working assumption at the agency training program in the US that like, it was basically blown from the get-go. Like it was, there was just, that was the working assumption that the SBU, like that was kind of like the cost of doing business with the SBU, was you were going to have folks that were going to be reporting back to the Russians.
I mean, I don't know if it was an intention in this particular case, but if you look back into the past, the stay-behind units in Europe, I mean, the Soviets knew about them, particularly like Detachment A in Berlin, which was Americans. Soviets knew about that. But that's part of the deterrence, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it was a surprise to them at all that we'd be doing it. And we're talking about the difficulties of reporting counterintelligence, because then you start getting to the wheels, within wheels, right? Where we want them to know, and we want them to know that we know that they know, like there's all these different psychological dimensions to it. And I think that was probably going on, but I also think that like SBU corruption has just been a problem. I don't know about, I mean, when the dust settles, literally, it'll be really interesting to see what kind of desertion there was, from those intelligence services. I can tell you that like nobody was paying attention to this, but like before the war broke out, the SBU has an English language website, and they were like every 2 days, they were just rolling up networks in Ukraine. I mean, that's what they were saying they were doing. I could never independently corroborate it, but they were like, we rolled up a pro-Russian network outside of Kharkiv. We rolled up a pro-Russian network outside of, Kherson. Like I don't know if that's precisely where, but that was just going on. Like they were basically like, we got to pull the trigger on every, every Russian network that we've been sitting on for X number of weeks or years right now. And it would be interesting to see if somebody has the sourcing about what was going on internally, and whether there were internal CI guys at SBU who were like finally pouncing on folks that they had been watching for a long time within their own service to say basically like enough, we can't afford to just sit and watch on you anymore. So
Yeah, that's interesting. Jackson, thank you very much. Probably a dumb question, but what would it take for ground branch guys to take substantive direct kinetic action, or is it extremely unlikely in Gen?
in general, I mean,
In general, yeah, I guess in general.
I mean, in general, I think, they were much more active in like Afghanistan, right? I mean, they're paramilitaries. I don't think them being directly engaged is in any way out of the question in terms of their kind of general MO. I think in Ukraine, I was told very reliably that they were not allowed at all. It was out of the question. It was like, we're not going to allow, you're there to train and advise. We don't want you taking shots across the line of contact. Doesn't matter if you want to do it. We don't want you to do it. And in fact, the guys that were sent were specifically sent because they were really mature. These were like folks that had been around the block. They'd come up through, special operations. They had a long experience. And the idea was they were not going to be trigger happy, and they were going to really try to keep things as like anti-escalatory as possible.
Right.
And I was told reliably that right before hostilities broke out, they pulled all those folks out because they were like, we don't want people in the country either. We don't want people in the country when shit hits the fan. And they might actually have to start fighting, to get out.
Right.
Right. So no, this was pure train and advise. And I think, I was also told by former officials that like, you don't want to get into a situation where, the Russians can credibly say the CIA paramilitary killed a Russian lieutenant, in the Donbass, or a CIA paramilitary gets shot. And then they, it's just the potential for things to spiral was pretty serious.
Right. Yeah. It begins to like justify, things that Putin says, even if it wasn't true to begin with.
Exactly. Right. And you get into that rhetorical trap, and whether fairly or not, you're then, you're then playing into their hands by providing them a reason to do more aggressive stuff. And so I think they calibrated that very, very carefully.
Carlos, thank you very much. Not sure if it's a silly question, but are non-state actors getting involved in a way that can influence the conflict? I work in finance, and there's chatter about deep pockets trying to get involved.
Oh, great story. I have no idea. I mean, I think you have obviously the international brigade. The Ukrainians have definitely been encouraging people from the U.S. and other Western countries to come fight on their behalf. There's evidence that has, some of those guys are like posting on Twitter and like photos of them like running around, Ukraine. So I think that's definitely happened and is happening. There was always a worry too that you would have both pro-Russia and pro-Ukraine neo-fascists like flock to the conflict. If that's happened in large numbers, we haven't seen that. But that was a worry pre-conflict that it was going to become a kind of like new Syria, but for like the far right. And beyond that, I don't know about private groups. I think that's a very interesting story, though. And if anybody has anything to say on that, they should contact me or Jack.
Well, I don't know if it's still a thing, but that Ukrainian magnate Kolomoisky or whatever was the one who kind of stood up like Azov, and like he had like 3 or 4 different units that he basically funded because they were better funded than before they were part of the Ukrainian military. He was funding them.
See, I didn't know that. That's interesting. I mean, I know Azov is still. My understanding is that Azov is still very much engaged in fighting in Mariupol, which is where they were based.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sense that those guys they're going to fight to the very bitter end. That seems to be the assessment. And so, yeah, I mean, Azov obviously, neo-fascist, at least parts of it. And there was, Russian neo-fascist groups too, like the Russian Imperial movement was one that I think had folks that were sent to the Donbass in the early days, or they traveled to the Donbass in the early days. I don't know about their activity now, but it'd be interesting to see or to find out whether those guys are also operating.
Yeah, let me just what because there were 4 or 5 units that he stood up. But anyway, yeah, it's just, but I mean, it's just a very interesting situation over there, in terms of, and I don't want to get into like the politics of it all or whatever, but yeah, I think that Azov is pretty much in Mariupol and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, and you could see again, nobody could foresee what happened in Syria in 2011. Like, if I told you in 2011, like, this is what Syria is going to look like in 2015, these are going to be the dominant actors, this is what cities are going to look like, you would have been like, no way. I mean, I think we don't know we don't know how long this conflict is going to last and how it's going to transform over time, in theory. And so we might see more non-state actors if the conflict tends to drag on.
Is that all the questions?
I think so. Let's see if we've got any more. No, that's it.
Okay. So Zach, thanks, man, for doing this. We covered a lot of ground here, I think, covered some of your greatest hits and the current situation in Ukraine. For people who are interested in reading your work, where can they find you?
Twitter, Zach S. Dorfman. And then, I mean, that's the best way, I guess, Yahoo News. I mean, yeah, I'd say Twitter is the easiest way to figure out what the news stories are. And then beyond that, wherever, I was going to say wherever newspapers are sold near you, but that really doesn't mean anything anymore. So I would say follow me on Twitter and then Yahoo News.
Are there any spicy stories you're working on that you can hint or allude to?
Oh, no way. Yes, but no way.
All right. Folks, thank you for joining us tonight and spending some time with the Team House. There's like 650 people watching live tonight, Zach. So, I mean, that's pretty cool.
That's great.
If you guys haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. Check out our link to our Patreon down in the description if you want to help support the channel and get access to some bonus episodes and segments. And, there's merch, too. There's merch down there if you want yourself a Team House coffee mug or anything like that. And next...
There's one more question.
Yeah, there's one more question.
Okay.
Robert, thank you very much. Thoughts as to why various, I think, Ukrainian government agencies haven't taken a lot of actions against very right-wing political groups like Azov is a lack of political will.
They need everybody they can get, man. I don't know. I mean, it's hard. You're gonna try to round up people. First of all, they couldn't round up people in Mariupol if they wanted to. The city's surrounded. They can't even get supplies in and out of that city. I mean, people are starving to death.
One more question.
I mean, I think they're in a situation where they're literally asking for foreigners to come in and fight for them. I mean, so I just think it's going to be very difficult for them to try to tamp down the Azov people. And even then, I mean, it seems like a very small percent. You're talking about a tiny percentage of the people that are fighting for and in Ukraine. So it's important to keep that perspective in mind too. I mean, it's easy to talk about the radicals as like the thing, but it's really not the thing. I mean, the Ukrainian military is the thing, and the civilian defense forces are the thing. And I mean, they're the ones doing the fighting. The radicals, the extremists, are a tiny.
Yeah, Azov is like 800 people, I think.
Yeah, they're bad, but like it's not the story.
It's very difficult too when you have a unit that is effective against combating an invading army. Like, what are you going to do at that point in time? Like, it's challenging. It's a challenging political situation for them.
It was much more challenging in Syria, honestly. I mean, again, this is a tiny group of people, and I think the Ukrainian military has conducted themselves with like a lot of professionalism, and then you have the defense forces, and you just have ordinary people getting basic training and doing stuff too. And so, yeah, I think it's always important to keep the proportions in mind. And there's a point in which talking about the extremists starts to feel almost ideological in itself, right? Because like, why are you focusing on this tiny group? I don't like the Azov people. I don't like neo-Nazis, but like focusing, like some of the Russian media, right, is talking about denazification, right? So like focusing on Azov when you're really talking about an entire country taking up arms against invaders is like, that's a classic, disinformation tactic or forest for the trees,
Right.
So, anyway.
There's one more.
There's one more question.
This for KJ right here, if you could read
Okay, we have one. Does Russia risk losing influence in Central Asia to the Chinese if they agree to accept more over Chinese help? Oh,
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, probably. I mean, that's probably part of the reason why. I mean, any alliance between Russia and China, Russia's going to be the junior partner, right?
Right.
Their economy is like the size of Italy's.
right.
You know, like they're a massive country with immense natural resources and a huge nuclear arsenal, but they're already the junior partner, and any kind of dependence on them economically or in terms of the military fight ahead is going to, of course, lead them to be the weaker partner. And I think that's already a big epochal shift, right?
Yeah.
That's a reversal of the 20th century that we're seeing in real time, right? So,
All right, this is the last question, guys. I'm not taking any more.
yeah.
Do
Okay, because I got to run actually.
Yeah,
I
sorry,
get
man.
Get it. Do you think Western mercenaries hired by Ukraine is a possibility? Do you feel any more overt Western action is possible without provoking Russia?
I mean, we're already doing so much, right? Like, there's always the do more, do more, do more. I mean, I'm not a policymaker, right? So I think it's like not entirely my place to say, but like, we're supplying like we supplied like over $1 billion in weapons. In
That was just the latest shipment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we are arming them in extraordinary ways right now, and so are NATO allies and some of our East Asian allies too. So, I mean, do we need to support mercenaries? Like, I don't know. Again, I'm not a policymaker, but I think what you're seeing is an extraordinary outpouring of Western military support for the Ukrainians, unprecedented, and it's easy to miss that. But that in no way was foreordained, right? Like, Milley being on the border of Poland and them just, setting up basically a massive pipeline of arms that continues to this day is it's an extraordinary show of support. I think there's so much sympathy out there that people want to do more, but it's also important it's important to step back and look at what's already going on and realize how historic that is.
All right, guys. Thank you, and we will see you next Friday. We're going to have a woman on the show, a female veteran who served in the cultural support teams. She's a CST. So looking forward to that. And again, thank you, Zach. Really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to come on the Team House today.
Yeah, thanks. It was amazing.
It was super fun. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, we'll see.